Welcome to the Fall 2019 Special Collections Exhibit and Lecture, Archaeology from Adam to Jesus. On exhibit here in the Rotunda are antiquities from APU's Bible Lands collection. The collection was donated to Azusa Pacific in April 2018 and is comprised of about 80 items, including pottery, metal, glass, covers many of the archaeological periods. It's developed with the express purpose to preserve artifacts in a teaching collection to demonstrate the cultural setting in which biblical events took place. We're pleased to exhibit 28 selected items from the collection today. Our speaker for the day is Dr. Robert Mullins. Bob Mullins is professor and chair of the Department of Biblical and Religious Studies at Azusa Pacific University, where he has taught for the past 13 years. He earned his Ph.D. in archaeology from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he also served as a research assistant to Professor Ami Matzar and the Beth Shean Valley Archaeological Project. In addition to archaeological works in Jerusalem, Beth Shean, Tel Rehov, and Gezer, Bob has also excavated at Tel Atkana and Tel Jaziri in southeastern Turkey. Bob currently co-directs the archaeological excavations at Tel Abel Beth Maacah on behalf of Azusa Pacific University with two longtime friends and colleagues, Dr. Nama Yahalam Mack and Dr. Nava Panitz Cohen of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Two of Bob's most recent publications are The Late Bronze Age with Eli Yanai in Volume 3 of the Pottery of Ancient Israel and Its Neighbors, and the Old Testament portion of the Atlas of the Biblical World with Mark Vitalis Hoffman, recently published by Fortress Press. Please join me in welcoming to the platform Dr. Bob Mullins.
Okay, hi everyone. It's a pleasure to be here, and thanks for coming. And I just hope that I don't put you to sleep during this presentation. But Ken did mention the Atlas of the Biblical World, and I just want to hold up a copy. This was just published. It came out about a month and a half or so ago. So this is very recent. If you're interested in gaining a kind of broader perspective on the biblical world, archaeology and text and getting that kind of backstory to the Bible, I highly recommend this. And you can find it easily. Just go to Amazon, type in Mullins, Atlas, and it'll pop right up. All right? Okay, so let's get started. The whole idea of this talk is to provide some context for these artifacts that you see around you. Because when you walk along and you just look at the displays, you don't have any really clear understanding of how this fits into the world at the time. And so this is part of what I hope to do today. And I thought I'd start off by just mentioning the fact that when it comes to the Old Testament, all the different archaeological and historical periods are based on materials that artifacts were made from. So we have, for example, early on, humans are making artifacts of stone. So we speak of the Stone Age. And then they came across the idea of using copper and making implements from copper. And so we have something called the Chalcolithic period, the Copper Stone Age. Then they figured out that you could add tin to copper and harden it to where it became a more durable metal. And so we have the Bronze Age, and then finally we get the invention of iron and carburized iron, and so we have the Iron Age. Now, you'll see later on that when we get to the New Testament period, we no longer talk about materials that artifacts are made from, but we think more in terms of nation states that are controlling regions. So we have the Roman period and the Byzantine period and so forth. What you see here on the slide just gives you a rough idea of the spans of time that these different periods are attributed to. For my talk today, we're going to be focusing mainly on the end of the Stone Age, called the Neolithic period. We're going to skip to the Bronze Age, and we'll get into the Iron Age, because these are the artifacts that we have on display. Now, that tail end of the Stone Age is today called the Neolithic period, New Stone Age. And this is a time when people have transitioned from hunter-gathering economy to a predominantly agricultural economy, growing their own food rather than going out and finding it and bringing it home. And so we get the establishment of farming villages. When you move to the Chalcolithic period, we start seeing, especially in Egypt and Mesopotamia, the first cities and the beginning of writing in Egypt and Mesopotamia. When we get to the Bronze Age, we will see the beginning of city-states. This is already even 1,000 years before Abraham. You get the beginning of walled cities in the Holy Land. And then we're going to move on to the Iron Age, where we speak about more developed cities and actual nation states, like Israel, Aram, Damascus, Ammon, Moab, Edom. These are all nation states. Now, why do we call this from Adam to Abraham? Well, Adam is convenient because in the Bible, Adam is portrayed as a farmer. He is living what we would call a Neolithic lifestyle. He's farming. And remember that as a punishment for his disobedience, Adam was to till the soil. And then we also read about Abel and Cain, who are sheep herders and farmers. So again, we're getting this kind of Neolithic lifestyle. So what can we say about the culture itself? Just a few items just to highlight. Even though the Neolithic period begins around 9000 BC, pottery doesn't show up until about 6000 BC. And here you see an example of a jar. It's made by hand, as you would expect for the beginning of pottery. The clay is very coarse. It's not very well fired, probably just fired in open pits. And some pieces are decorated, like you see here, with these incised lines. Now, on display, we have one of the bowls that it's somewhat similar to what you see the arrow pointing to, which is our example of the Neolithic period. And so what you're seeing here doesn't start until about 6000 BC. Now, of course, you ask the question, so what did people do before 6000? What did they do before there was pottery? Well, we know that they used skins, they had implements made of wood, and we also know that they had basketry. And we know this because there is a cave nearby the Dead Sea called Nahal Hamar, where inside the cave, they found still preserved basketry from the Neolithic period, from about 5000 BC. And because of the dry climate, it's been preserved. And one of the things that experts have noticed is that the basketry is very intricately woven. In other words, there's already been a long history of making items from basketry. Now, probably the most famous Neolithic site is Jericho. Now, there are dozens, hundreds of Neolithic sites all around the Middle East, this map that you're looking at here, but I just want to highlight Jericho as the most famous example. And of course, everyone knows the story of Joshua and Jericho, so I thought this would be a good choice. Here is the Tell of Jericho that you see here, and here's what Jericho looked like in the Neolithic period. It is a walled city. It is the earliest walled city that we know of. And so for this reason, archaeologists, and even if you ever visit Jericho, you'll see signs saying the world's oldest city. And this is partly why. You have a city wall that protects it, and inside you see these round houses where people live their lives. And they even have a watchtower on the wall there to kind of view the surroundings. Now, moving on from the Neolithic period, let's go to the Bronze Age. As I say, we don't have any artifacts here specifically from the Chalcolithic period, so I'm just going to skip that and move on to the Bronze Age, which, as you see here, is from 3500 to 1200 BC. So that's a big span of time. And of course, a lot of changes take place over a couple thousand years. And so what archaeologists and historians have done is to divide the Bronze Age into three major phases: early, middle, and late. And as you see here, the early begins around 3500. This is well before Abraham. okay? Because Abraham shows up on the scene during the Middle Bronze Age around 2000. So some of what we're going to be looking at is 1,000 years before Abraham. Again, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob belong to what we call the Middle Bronze Age, and then the Late Bronze Age would be the time of Moses, the Hebrews in Egypt, the Exodus, and really ending with the conquest of Canaan by Joshua. So let's look at each one of these three phases. We have here the Early Bronze Age, and the vessels at this time are still handmade. We have no wheel-made items at all yet. They're still handmade. The clays are still very coarse, a little bit better fired than they were earlier in the Neolithic period. But we start to see a use of painted decoration quite a bit. It's quite popular, especially, as I say here, between 3500 and 2700 BC. Now, the other popular painted style during the time are these vessels here covered by a red coating, what we call red slip, and burnished. In other words, they take a stone or piece of wood and they polish it to give it a nice polished sheen. So these vessels would be quite typical of this period. Now, what's happening in the country? Well, we have the beginning of city-states. Now, already in Egypt and Mesopotamia, from before this, 1,000 years before this, you're having the beginnings of cities. But within the land of Canaan, we don't have cities coming on the scene until the early Bronze Age, somewhere around 3200 BC. And basically, as you see by this map, all the black dots are indicating major cities that were walled cities, and they're called city-states because each city-state, surrounded by a wall, had its own king, and they controlled territory around it of smaller towns and villages that would be more or less equivalent to our counties, all right? And so it's somewhat like, the feudal system, you might say, to some degree. Here's just one example of one of these early Bronze Age cities. This one, again, is from about 3000 BC. You can see an example of the city wall that surrounds it with these semicircular towers protecting it. Notice at the top there you've got houses, because of course this is a city with houses, people living in it. You can see off to the right that there is a temple complex here because they had their gods that they worshipped. And the other item I want to point out is there's a reservoir because Arad is located in the desert. And water is very scarce, and yet you've got a city of several thousand people living in it. So how are they going to get their water? So one of the ways they collected water is that they built a system whereby when it rained, all the water would drain towards this reservoir. And then the sediment would sit towards the bottom, and they had what would in fact be a big cistern. Here's an artist's depiction of what a typical family compound would look like. Remember, this is Old Testament times, so people are living as extended families, several houses belonging to children and grandchildren, all in the same compound. And this is an actual house from Arad of this period of time. Notice that you've got this doorway on the east, it's a rectangular shape, and notice on the inside you can see benches. And this is an example of a group sitting in one of these houses that's been partially restored to give you an idea of how, people would go to the family home and they would sit around on these benches and talk and eat and so forth, and they can even use them for sleeping. All right, let's move on to from Abraham to Moses. This depiction you see here comes from a tomb in Middle Egypt called Beni Hassan. And it depicts Canaanite traders. And so if you want to know what did Abraham look like and Isaac and Jacob, here you've got a beautiful example. If you look to the left side, you see the two men. One is holding a composite bow, which is becoming very popular precisely in this period of time. He also is holding a battle axe in his right hand, which they would use in warfare, a sharp blade that they basically would crack the skull of their opponent. You can see how the women are dressed. By the way, looking at their colorful clothing, who does this remind you of? If we think about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who does it remind you of? Joseph and the coat of many colors, okay? This is the kind of thing that is in the mind of the biblical readers, all right? And you'll see that they have donkeys as animals for beasts of burden. I might also point out the second man from the left, to the right of the man on the left there, is holding a lyre. This is just like the lyre that David would have played. Same style, didn't change over thousands of years. And here's a typical vessel of the Middle Bronze Age. This one is thrown on the fast wheel. This is the period, Abraham, when we begin to see potters sitting down and using a kick wheel to spin very, very quickly to make beautifully shaped forms. The clays are very fine, the firing is first rate, and when decorated, this red polished slip is what's very, very popular. Now, based on archaeological finds as well as Egyptian depictions, we have this artistic recreation of a typical Canaanite family in the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So again, Abraham himself would have looked something similar to this. Notice the beards, notice the furniture that they're sitting on. How do they know what this furniture looked like? We do have some depictions on Egyptian tombs of furniture, but actually the furniture that you see here was found in a tomb in Jericho. Again, because of the dry climate, it's nearby the Dead Sea, wood survived 4,000 years. And so the artist then is using actual furniture as examples for his depiction here. You also see on the table there, the arrow is pointing at a vessel, typical again of the time of Abraham and the ancestors. Notice the woman reaching into a storage jar where they could keep grain, they can keep wine, they can keep oil. And notice that you have the different fruits of the land. You have pomegranates, you have wheat, barley, you have dates, all kinds of goodies. And seeds of these have been preserved in tombs. So we know a lot about their diet. Now, to help illustrate the patriarchal period, I want to use our site, APU site of Abel Beth Maacah, as an example of some finds and what a typical city would have looked like in the time of Abraham. Now, as Ken mentioned, I co-direct this project on behalf of APU with my two colleagues from the Hebrew University, Naama and Nava Panitz-Cohen, who I've known for many, many years. And all three of us were students of this fellow that you see standing in the middle, probably one of the most well-respected archaeologists in Israel today, Amichai Mazar, flanked by two APU students that dug with us on the dig. So let me make a little plug. If you would be interested in coming digging with us, in 2021, there will be an APU study tour to Israel, where there'll be a 2-week study tour of Israel, followed by 2 weeks on the dig for those that would be interested in extending their stay and digging with us. If that doesn't work for you, you can still join us. We're digging every summer, and we can do an independent study if you want to get credit for it. So all you need to do is, if you're interested, just drop me an email. Just type in Robert Mullins, it'll pop up on your APU email, and then we can work something out. Now, the site of Abel Beth Maacah is located right smack on the border of Lebanon and Syria today. And this was not only the case today, but even in antiquity, it was also in a borderlands region. It's just that then Lebanon was known as Phoenicia, Syria was known as Aram, and Israel, of course, was Israel. And here, this photo shows you how close we are to the Lebanese border. But quiet, secure, beautiful place to be. And to give you a little bit of an impression of the Tel, I want to show you this video we took last summer using our drone. And here we're approaching the Tel from the south. Area F there at the bottom is the southern tip of the city, where we found fortification walls from the time of Abraham. And the drone is now turning north, And as it goes up the lower city, this very elongated tell, look to the right, that little square area we just opened up this summer where we found an inscription that I'll talk about in a little bit. That big tree is where we have our breakfast every morning out in the field. And then we're coming up on Area A. This is our largest and most important area. This basically documents the period of the judges through the time of King David. So stories in the Bible, like the wise woman of Abel Beth Maacah, are belonging to this phase that you just saw there. Now the drone is flying to the upper city, on the higher part of the tell, and you can see Area B, where we have a large Israelite period building, some sort of administrative building. Some of you that may have heard of the little faience head that I'll show you a little bit later that may depict a biblical king was found inside that building. The drone is now flying along the northern edge of the site, so you can, by looking down, you can see how elongated this tell is. It's about 25 acres in size. Those little bumps that you see at the very northern end are Israeli army bunkers. All right? And as the drone flies now along the western side, you get another glance of Area B in the upper city. All this area would have been inhabited in the time of David and also during the divided monarchy. There you can see, again, Area A at the very top end of the lower city. And the drone's going to kind of circle in on that. Again, all of these remains you see here from the time of David. And look at all the area that we have to excavate. We can dig here for a decade and find a lot of cool stuff. This is one of the most important sites for the time of David, even the period of the judges in all of Israel. And here you get a glance looking down the Hula Valley, the upper Jordan Valley, towards the Sea of Galilee, which is about a 45-minute drive to the south. Well, here's how we think the city would have looked like in the time of Abraham. Remember, we talked about city-states in the early Bronze Age. We had city-states also in the Middle Bronze Age. And again, you would have a walled city with a king controlling territory of smaller towns and hamlets and stuff surrounding it. Most of these cities, including our site, has the lower city, and then the upper city is where you have this Acropolis, where you would have your temple, you would have your palace that the king lived in, and so forth. Just to kind of feature one of the nice pieces we found at our site from the time of Abraham is this nice juglet here that you can see, again, beautifully decorated, wheel-made, very well done, all right? Now, the period that follows the time of the ancestors would be the late Bronze Age, which is the time of Hebrew bondage in Egypt, Moses, and the Exodus. Now, the pottery is pretty much continuing the same tradition of the Middle Bronze Age, but there is some deterioration. They're not using the fast wheel anymore. They're using a slower wheel. And the firing and decoration isn't as well done as it used to be. And some of this reason may be for what I'm going to talk about in just a moment. But I want to just point out that you can see the decorative motifs that they have here, and especially on the left side. This motif of the date palm tree, which represents the tree of life in the ancient Near East, including ancient Israel, flanked by two ibex. This is a persistent theme in Canaanite decoration and even in Israelite as well, as we'll be seeing a little bit later. So what were the political situations at the time? Well, throughout the late Bronze Age, after the time of Abraham, up to Joshua, Egypt is controlling the land of Canaan. And you see how the gray swath goes up where Israel is today. This was all under Egyptian control, Egyptian administration. Now, why did the Egyptians want to control Canaan? Well, a couple of reasons. One is to milk the country for a lot of its agriculture, that items that cannot be grown in Egypt were in abundance in Canaan. And so they could bring these goods to Egypt. The other is that you had a couple of big empires at the time that were wanting to push their way southwards, the Hittites and the Hurrians of the kingdom of Mitanni. And so Egypt wanted to be in Canaan in order to hold them back so they don't invade Egypt. The other thing that interested the Egyptians and everyone living at the time is trade. Mediterranean trade, particularly coming from the Aegean world and from the island of Cyprus, which was then called Alatia. We don't have any of the Aegean or Cypriot pottery available to us here, but this just gives you a kind of a visual idea. So the Late Bronze Age is a time of internationalization, trade and exchange going on throughout the ancient world at the time. Now, at the very southern tip of the city of the Middle and Late Bronze Age, we have this tower that the circle is surrounding. And I'm highlighting this because we had a very, very nice find on the floor of a room abutting this tower, dating to the time of Moses. And this woman, Diane, is holding a small jug. And what was amazing is that inside this jug was found this hoard of silver. You see all these small broken pieces of silver, earrings and so forth. These were used in monetary exchange because coins are not around yet. And so the way that people did monetary exchange was to take a valuable metal like silver or gold and weigh it. So the shekel that's so well known from the Bible is not a coin, but a unit of weight. And so you'd put let's say, a 1 shekel weight on one pan of a pan scale, and you put on the silver on the other until it balances out, and that's your 1 shekel of silver. So I do have some examples of such weights. The one in the lower right is actually a 2 shekel weight. Above it, we have a weight called the pim. Now, until the discovery of this particular weight, no one knew what a pim was. If you go to 1 Samuel 13:21, it says that the Israelites would go to the Philistines to sharpen their tools, and it cost them 1 pim. But we don't know how much a pim is. Well, now that we have the weight, we know that it's 2/3 of a shekel. And you'll read that actually if you have, let's say, an NIV Bible, it will actually tell you 2/3 of a shekel. They just give you the translated unit of weight. And the one to the left of that in the upper left-hand corner is a beka. It's a 1/2 shekel weight, all right? And I might point out with the silver earrings in particular, of course, we always are thinking in terms of our culture that only women wear earrings, or for the most part. Okay, but in antiquity, we have examples like the 2 Assyrian men you see in the upper right wearing earrings as well. So men and women wore earrings in antiquity. And we even, because of our discovery, were featured by La Cucaracha, those of you that are familiar with that cartoon strip dealing with our discovery. Now, we find a lot of other cool things in the Late Bronze Age that just open the Bible to us. For example, everyone has heard of Baal. Baal and Asherah. Okay, so who is Baal? Well, his full name is actually Baal Hadad. Baal means Lord or Prince or Master. Hadad is his personal name. So Baal is really a title. And Hadad is his personal name. Hadad means thunderer. So Lord Thunderer or Prince Thunderer would be his full name. He's symbolized by the young bull and is often depicted as standing on the back of the bull. We have a lot of depictions of Baal on the back of a bull. He had 3 wives. The 2 most, I would say, well-known that are known from the Bible are Baal and Astarte, who is called actually in the Bible Ashtoreth. And also, and probably even more famous than Baal and Ashtoreth, is Baal and Asherah, who was actually originally his father El's wife. But Baal stole away his father's wife and took her to himself. And so it's Baal and Asherah that are mentioned most commonly in the Old Testament. But again, if you're just reading the Bible without this kind of background, it's hard to appreciate this kind of larger religious culture of which Israel was a participant in some regards. Okay, let's move on to what we call the United Monarchy, from the time of Samuel, Saul, David, and even Solomon. This depiction you see here is of a griffin. This is what the Bible calls a seraph, cherubim and seraphim. Okay, this is a seraph. And this is an Israelite depiction. This was found at Megiddo from the time of the United Monarchy. And so this is a time when we have developed cities and we start developing nation states, like David, the king of a nation, Israel, all right? But it took Israel about 200 years to get to that place of being a nation state. For the first 200 years, from the time of Joshua up until around King Saul, we're dealing with the period of the Judges, where people are basically farmers living in the hill country. And so all the dots that you see here are the various Israelite villages that were in the hills. You have one example of Beersheba here that would be typical of these highland villages from the time of Gideon and other people that you read about from this time. It's also worth pointing out that this is when we first start seeing Israelite writing. And this particular one is interesting. It says, Ishbal ben Beda. Ishbal is a name known from the Bible. He was one of Saul's son. Now, this particular Ishbal is not related to Saul. He's a son of Beda, not Shaul. But it's the same name, okay? Man of Baal, literally, is what the name means. And so this name does appear on an inscription at a site called Khirbet Kayafa. But I would say that, if we think about the United Monarchy, and particularly David, Jerusalem, of course, is the city that captures most of our imagination. And Jerusalem of David's time was basically a city of about 10 to 15 acres, sitting on a kind of elongated hill that's encircled by the yellow here. And notice how the mountains surrounding that are higher than the hill on which Jerusalem itself is sit. And you get that impression when you're in the city of David, you look around and all the hills are surrounding you. So if you go to Jerusalem, read Psalm 125:2 and see if the Bible doesn't come alive for you. That's a little plug to go on a trip to Israel. It is very well worth it. You will be amazed at how it opens the Bible to you. Here's an artist's depiction of what the city would have looked like in David's time. Notice how his palace is at the highest point of the hill. So when we read the story of David and Bathsheba and how David is spying on Bathsheba, who's on her rooftop, you understand why. Because he is commanding the highest point of the city. Now, David is a known historical figure. We do have an inscription from Tel Dan, a site about 4.5 miles east of Abel Beth Maacah, that mentions the Hazael, king of Aram Damascus, killing both the king of Israel and the king of the House of David, which is another way of saying the southern kingdom of Judah, because we're dealing with the lineage of David. This is the only mention that we have to date of David outside the pages of the Bible. So this is external evidence for the historical existence of King David. Even though the inscription itself is about 150 years later than David, it's alluding to the founder of the Davidic dynasty. Now, from the same period of David, our site of Abel Beth Maacah comes back into focus because we have a very famous story, somewhat infamous, you might say, because it involves a guy getting his head chopped off, but it involves our site. A rebel by the name of Sheba has insulted David, called for revolt against him, and he hightails it to our city from Jerusalem. And so David sends Joab, his military commander, to capture him. And indeed, he is ready. He has surrounded the city. He is ready to conquer it in order to take this rebel into custody. And who negotiates with him but a woman who's only described as a wise woman? There are several things about her that intrigue us. One is the fact that she has authority. She negotiates with Joab. She doesn't say, let me go get permission from the elders to turn him over to you. She makes a decision. The other thing is interesting is that when she's speaking with Joab, she's describing the city as a place of inquiry. The Hebrew word suggests some sort of divination going on, and a place of peacemaking, settling disputes between people. And it's interesting in this regard. Archaeologists are always looking for parallels from other countries in the surrounding Near East for, like, what is this wise woman? Do we have parallels to this? Well, we find a parallel from 300 years before David in Anatolia, which we know today as Turkey, where there are wise women, several of them, many of them even mentioned by name. And these women are ritual experts. They're involved in divination, giving oracles, purification rites. They are involved in advice giving, and they're regarded as repositories of folk knowledge for the culture. Many aspects of this seem to kind of echo this wise woman of our site. And so, and we may actually have some indication of whatever ritual activity that she was involved in the Davidic area of our city. You're looking now at a picture of a small temple or shrine, where you see where it says main hall, and notice that we have this very unique installation, offering table, cult stones, and also we have this jug filled with, can anyone figure out what those are inside that jug? They are animal knuckle bones. More than 400 knuckle bones of sheep, goat, gazelle, deer, most of them belonging to females. But such hoards are, in virtually every case, related to divination. And so, this is, I think, to us is quite interesting because it may, to some degree, reflect this culture of the city that the wise woman was attached to. Just this past summer, we found this very nice find here. It's a seal showing the face of a person on one side, and on the belly side, we have the tree of life, flanked not by ibex on both sides, but an ibex on the right and an ostrich on the left. Okay, this is an Israelite seal. So it shows the continuation of these traditions even from the earlier periods into the Israelite period. All right, let's move to the period of the divided monarchy. And here too we have a seal. This is also from Megiddo. It says in Hebrew, Lishma Eved Yerovoam, belonging to Shema, servant of Jeroboam, probably Jeroboam II, a king of the northern kingdom. Let me just point out there are a couple of capitals during the divided monarchy. You have Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel in the north, Jerusalem, of course, in the south. And I just want to show you one picture from Samaria where the royal Acropolis was excavated at the very early in the 20th century. The drawing on the right kind of shows you the surviving outlines of this palace. And amongst the items that were found were several of these ivory depictions of cherubim. Now again, when you read about cherubim in the Bible, cherubim guarding access to the Garden of Eden, we're not talking about babies with arrows and little Cupid kinds of things, nor are we talking about angels. These are the creatures that are being spoken of here. And these are Israelite depictions. So these are the creatures that the Israelites had in mind. These were used actually as inlays to wooden furniture, to walls, and so forth. And so when you read in the book of Amos, where he's castigating the wealthy of Samaria, the capital city of the north, and saying, you live in your ivory palaces, we're not talking about palaces made of ivory. We're talking about palaces that were adorned in ivory with such ivory inlays. The other capital city, Jerusalem, a smaller city in the time of David, a little bit larger in Solomon's time. In Solomon's time, it becomes about 30 acres in size. But after the fall of the northern kingdom and many exiles of the north fleeing to the south and living in Jerusalem, we get Hezekiah encircling Jerusalem and all those refugees with a city wall that you see highlighted here in orange, bringing Jerusalem to 150 acres, a population of about 20,000. And this was the size of Jerusalem up until the Babylonians destroyed the city in 586. Now, many, many finds, important finds come from this city, but let me just highlight a few here because I think they will be of interest. We have a seal. This is the actual seal with the name of Jezebel on one example. The other example is a fellow by the name of Abdi. These are usually made of stone, precious stone, and they are carved by special carvers. And what they do is they would wear them as signet rings on their finger or wear them around their neck. They are officials. And if they send off a letter, that letter is going to be written on a papyrus document, rolled up, and as you see in the example above, clay lumps are going to be put on the strings that tie the document closed, and then they take that signet ring and they impress their stamp on there. So it's somewhat like, the letters that you would write to your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you'd put the sealing wax on there and then put in that monogram. It's the same concept. But I would say probably the most interesting one that's come out of Jerusalem is one belonging to King Hezekiah himself, found just 2 years ago. Belonging to Hezekiah, Melech Yehudah, belonging to Hezekiah, king of Judah. We also have a seal of Baruch, Jeremiah's scribe, Baruch ben Neriah. And here you can see his name written in the Hebrew, and we have a fingerprint also on here. When the impression was made, the finger slipped off and hit the wet clay. So who knows, this could be the fingerprint of Baruch, for all we know. So very, very cool stuff. Well, let me show you the latest cool thing. Our Area K, we just opened this past summer. We found part of a room filled with jars. This particular jar, when we restored it, we found that there is on there, and I don't know how well you can see it, there's an inscription written on there in ink on the jar. This is a bit of a close-up of it. Again, I'm not sure how clear it is. It's very, very faint. But we've just had 2 epigraphers, 2 specialists in ancient Hebrew writing, confirm that what it says, and you're the first ones to see this, okay? No one else has seen this translation yet. And it's belonging to Benaiah. Now, Benaiah is not attested anywhere in yet in inscriptions, but it is the northern Israelite form of Benaiah. Now, Benaiah, which is the Judean form, the Yah ending rather than the Yo ending of northern Israelites, Benaiah was one of David's merry men, and later he becomes Solomon's military commander. And actually, in the transition of power from David to Solomon, Benaiah is one of Solomon's supporters. So this is the same name, but this individual, rather than Benaiah, the Judean ending, he's a northern Israelite, so he has Benaiah. We have, for example, Zechariah. Everyone knows the prophet Zechariah. In the north, it's Zechariah. It's that yo ending. All right? So a northern Israelite name showing up on this jar. And we think that this room could be a storeroom. And so next summer, one of the things we're going to be looking for are more jars, perhaps other inscriptions with other personal names on them. One more thing that I just want to show you. Remember in the video that you saw, Area B in the upper city, part of a building, a big administrative building, but as you see here, what I've highlighted in blue are just a few of the walls of this much larger building, but already cool stuff has come out of it. For example, from a pit outside this building, we have this figurine head of a woman, probably the goddess Astarte, done in Phoenician style. We have this beautiful decorated jar, Phoenician bichrome jar, indicating trade relations going on with Phoenicia, today known as Lebanon. And we have this very famous head now, depicting some sort of an elite. We don't know if he was a general, governor of the city, or maybe even a king. If it is a king, it could be someone like Hazael of Damascus. It could be someone like Ahab or Jehoram of Israel. It could also be a Phoenician, because they all look the same. They all dress the same. But obviously, the quality tells us that it's a very important figure. And then just this past summer, we found this figurine of a woman holding a tambourine. These are quite common in northern Israel. And to give you a little bit better look at this building, we did this past summer 3D modeling of all of our areas. I'm just selecting this one little bit here and just rotating it to show what can be done now with technology, where we can actually measure accurately lengths and widths of walls. We can even descend down inside individual rooms and study the relationships between different walls and floors without ever going back in the field. We have everything digitized and available to us. Okay, let's move on to the New Testament, and this is where I'm going to wrap things up. Again, the shift is from using materials as period identifiers to the cultures that actually controlled these various places. And so Roman Byzantine period, which would include the time of Jesus. Here you see some of the maps showing some of the primary cities, including Capernaum, where Jesus ministered, Jerusalem, where he was crucified, oil lamp of the period. And I put this passage out of Matthew 25 because it illustrates, it's the parable of the 10 virgins. This is the type of oil lamp that's being referred to. And also Matthew 5, putting a lamp on a lampstand, not putting it underneath a bowl. And so here you have these examples here. When it comes to Jesus, this is what Jerusalem would have looked like in Jesus' time, beginning with the upper room, okay, where Jesus celebrated the Last Supper with his disciples, going over to the Garden of Gethsemane, where he's betrayed by Judas, taken before Caiaphas. We know approximately the location of the house of Caiaphas. He then is placed in front of Herod Antipas and Pilate, Pontius Pilate, where Pilate condemns him to death by crucifixion. And then you see here the site of the crucifixion. Now, what I want to do to kind of wrap things up is to focus on the crucifixion. But on the way, I just might mention that we do have historical evidence for Pontius Pilate. We know that he actually lived in Caesarea, a big city on the coast, and was in Jerusalem because it was Passover time. But we have coins, we have depictions, we have inscriptions, all related to this prefect of Judah in the time of Jesus. Now, when it comes to the place of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, all of these are housed today inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, or as the original builders called it, the Church of the Resurrection. We know quite a bit about methods of crucifixion, in part because we have found in a tomb in Jerusalem an ankle bone of a crucified man with a nail driven in. Now, according to the nail in the ankle, the man that you see, it would be on the left side. It appears that the nails were driven in from the side. Now, we typically think that only Jesus was nailed to the cross. This is not true. People, generally, everyone was nailed because, remember, this is capital punishment. And so they want to make it as cruel and painful as possible. And so these individuals, as well as Jesus, were all nailed to the cross. Now, this just briefly shows how what was originally a tomb that Jesus was buried in and nearby place of Calvary later was cut away from the hillside and enclosed within the church. We don't have the time to go through that, but I thought it would be helpful to, when we're talking about how Jesus was buried, especially, to compare it with Old Testament practices. In the Old Testament times, people were buried in burial caves, of which you see these small openings below the houses. These are all burials from the time of Hezekiah, the prophet Isaiah, and so forth. Now, each of these burials usually would lead to a hall where you have several rooms stemming off that central hall with burial benches on them where the bodies would be laid on the bench. Here we have a kind of an example here showing a small entrance, a burial bench with a kind of holding, some sort of a holder for the head. Where the body would be laid for about a year to allow the flesh to decay. Now you can see that there are more than one places for burial here, because over the course of the year, other people would die. And so you need to have several openings and places available for anyone that would also die during the year, because it takes about a year for the flesh to fully decay. The family would return after the course of the year, and they would take the bones, and in Old Testament times anyways, they threw them into a common repository underneath, as you see in this cutaway drawing. This is where the biblical expression, to be gathered to one's fathers, comes from. You're literally gathered to your fathers. And your bones are thrown in with Uncle John and Henry and Frank and great-grandfather. Everyone is mixed together. This is the collective identity of ancient Israel. By the way, these students here are illustrating how these burial benches were used. Now, inside the repository, we not only find bones, but we find also pottery, because they're giving them burial gifts, okay? But in this particular Cave 25 came this small metal scroll that, when it was unrolled, bore the priestly benediction known from Numbers 6. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord shine his face upon you and grant you peace. So this is dating to about the time of King Josiah. Now, with New Testament burial, it's a little bit different. You're still burying a person, you're wrapping them in a shroud, and you're still burying them for about a year to allow the flesh to decay. This takes place in that second room, that inner room. Now, after the course of the year, the family returns, and what they do is they gather the bones, but they don't put them into a common repository underneath. They put them into individual bone boxes called ossuaries. And once they're buried there, then they would be slid into compartments that are in the first room, and that would open the burial bench for future generations of people to die and be buried. And so you'll find these tombs, they're family sepulchres, and they last several generations. We have one example of a rolling stone tomb. I think is a kind of a nice example what the tomb that Jesus was buried in would have looked like. Here you see the entrance to it with the rolling stone off to the right. The picture above is showing the first room, which is where all the bone boxes are stored. And then the inner room, you can see the burial bench with that arch above it called an archaeological, where the body was laid out, and then the bones gathered. So the New Testament, a bit more emphasis on the individual, because many of these ossuaries even include the name of the person, includes their profession, rather than Old Testament times, which is much more collective identity. And that concludes it.
So let's thank Bob for his lecture today. Good job.